Good morning, everybody. Last week's text, Jesus pronounced woes or judgment on the scribes and Pharisees due to their keeping people out of heaven by directing them away from Jesus. But on the flip side, not only are they keeping people out of heaven, they're also damning people into hell because they're winning converts to their ultra self-righteous, legalistic faith. Or should I say their religion, which has nothing to do with Jesus, nothing to do with depending on God's grace for salvation, and everything to depend on themselves and being good enough. Jesus wasn't happy about it. And so the thing that we made a big deal about last week was what we win them with is what we win them to. And the thing that we must be winning people with is the good news of Jesus. We must be winning people with the gospel message that Jesus has come to die and pay for the sin of humanity so that people can have a way to God. There is no other way to God apart from Jesus. You can't save yourself. Jesus is the way. I used the illustration that they were standing in front of the narrow gate, directing people to the broad gate. Narrow is the path that leads to righteousness, and wide and broad is the path that leads to destruction. Many are on it. That's what Jesus says. The Pharisees are standing in front of the narrow gate, which is Jesus. Hey, no, over here. Take the broad path. Take our self-righteous, legalistic religion. That's the way to go. Jesus wasn't happy. He takes very seriously people getting the gospel wrong or denying the gospel. That leads us to our text today, though. Let's read verses 16 through 19. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, if anyone swears by the temple, it is nothing. But if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he is bound by his oath. You blind fools, for which is greater, the gold or the temple that has made the gold sacred? And you say, if anyone swears by the altar, it is nothing. But if anyone swears by the gift that is on the altar, he is bound by his oath. You blind men, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? Here's point one. If you're writing things down, taking notes, filling in blanks. Judgment against inconsistent honesty. Judgment against inconsistent honesty. That's what Jesus is declaring judgment on. That's his woe. Woe against these people who are inconsistently honest. Maybe even unpredictably honest at times. Never know when they're telling the truth and never know when they're lying. I was raised growing up that taking the Lord's name in vain always meant never swearing to God. I swear to God. You'd hear people say that. It was etched into my brain that is not a phrase that is a part of your vernacular. You are never to use such terminology. However, in the Old Testament, people swore to the Lord or swore to God quite frequently, and it was a means of taking oaths. What this did was call upon God to bear witness to the oath or commitment that was being made and ultimately hold them accountable to the promise they were making. It was binding. There was a sense in which when people called God into an oath, they were saying, God judge me or execute justice if I don't keep my word. You could be confident that if someone swore in God's name in the Old Testament times, that they were going to do whatever they were promising or whatever they were committing to. Because they were calling down God's judgment and to some extent wrath if they don't. They were going to do it because they knew God was watching. They knew God is omniscient and all-knowing and that he hears and knows what you say. So they didn't mess around. They were going to do it if they'd committed to it. If we look at our text, we see the word swears and we see the word oath. Oath is repeated twice. Swears, if anyone swears is 1, 2, 3 or 4 times just in these few verses. And so that's what we know what we're talking about. We're talking about making oaths. The problem that Jesus is dealing with and the thing that he is declaring judgment on, if you're writing notes down, the problem was that over time the Pharisees created a system in which people could swear by lesser things than God. And sometimes the things they would swear by were binding and sometimes they weren't. I'm going to read that again because I might have messed it up. The problem was that over time the Pharisees created a system in which people could swear by lesser things. And sometimes the things they would swear by were binding, and other times they were not. We'll unpack more of that as we go on here. It allowed people to be seemingly genuine because they swore an oath or a promise, but in reality they would renege on the promise or oath because of the specific oath they chose. They wouldn't swear in God's name. They'd pick something else. And sometimes it would be binding and sometimes it wouldn't, based upon the system that the Pharisees had fabricated. This is all what Jesus is pointing to in our text. We see in verse 16, if anyone swears by the temple, it is nothing. Meaning, if you swear by the temple, you don't have to keep that. It looks good and it seems honest and genuine, but you really don't have to do whatever you're going to say. He goes on, though, and says in verse 16, but if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he is bound by his oath. You could swear by the temple and not do whatever you committed. But if you swear by the gold of the temple, you'd better do what you said, based upon this system that the Pharisees had come up with. People had to pay close attention and listen to how oaths were made to make sure they didn't get snookered. You had to pay attention because someone might be pulling your leg. Did they swear by the gold of the temple or by the temple? I don't remember which. Jesus addresses how ridiculous this is in verse 17, saying, you blind fools, for which is greater, the gold or the temple that has made the gold sacred? According to the Pharisees, the deal was only good if you swore by the gold of the temple. And it would be the gold that makes the oath significant. But Jesus' point is the gold that isn't sacred or important in and of itself. It's really the temple that makes the gold sacred because the temple is where God lives. They had it backwards. He's saying, this is a joke. This doesn't make any sense. This is preposterous. The people wanted to make the sincerity of the oath revolve around the gold of the temple, when in reality it is the temple itself that makes the gold sacred and important. Their oath system is a joke. Jesus declares judgment on their inconsistent honesty by calling them blind fools. Jesus gives another example in verse 18 saying, if anyone swears by the altar, it is nothing. But if anyone swears by the gift that is on the altar, he is bound by his oath. Once again, very crazy amount of minutia here. Just subtle word changes made all the difference in this system that the Pharisees had come up with. Jesus goes on and once again explains why this is silly in verse 19, saying, you blind men, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? The gift means nothing unless it's on the altar that is sacred, and it's in the temple that God dwells in and belongs to God. Jesus declares judgment on their inconsistent honesty by calling them blind men. By Jesus referring to the Pharisees and scribes as blind men, blind fools, and blind guides, this is an indictment and judgment because these are supposed to be men who are leading the people of God. Now, how well do the blind lead anybody? Do they lead people well? No. Blind people don't lead people well because they can't see where they're going and they don't know what's in front of them. And so Jesus is condemning them and judging them and saying, you're blind guides. You don't know what you're doing. They lead terribly. The only place the blind Pharisees are leading people is into judgment because they're teaching people to be dishonest. You don't always have to tell the truth. You don't always have to keep your word. You only have to do it in this instance and this instance. But in these instances over here, you don't have to worry about it. You can fudge what you say. Jesus is declaring judgment against inconsistent honesty. This leads to our second point. Second point is that our word must be good. Our word must be good. Let's read verses 20 and 20 through 22. So whoever swears by the altar swears by it and everything on it. And whoever swears by the temple swears by it and by him who dwells in it. And whoever swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it. Second point is our word must be good. If you're filling in blanks, writing notes down, here it is. The point Jesus is making here is that everything that is sworn is ultimately related to God and should be seen as binding. Our word must be good. And that's what Jesus does in verse 21. He ultimately relates everything back to God. He says in verse 21, and whoever swears by the temple swears by it and him who dwells in it. And so anything in the temple, you're also swearing by the one who dwells in the temple. Whose temple is it? It's God's temple. Who dwells there? It's God who dwells there. So it doesn't matter if you swear by the gold of the altar or just the altar, or the gold of the temple or the temple. It doesn't matter. It's all God's, and you're to some extent swearing to God, and it should be binding. That's what Jesus is saying. Your word must be good. Same by heaven. So if we jump back to Matthew 5, you remember in Matthew 5, and Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, he talks about this same thing. He says, and talks about their swearing to heaven. Jesus addresses that. He says, whoever swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it. You can't swear by heaven and get out of having a legitimate oath because it's God who sits enthroned in heaven. And so this all relates back to the Old Testament way of thinking and swearing in God's name. Okay? They all go back to God. All oaths, whether you think they're binding or not, are binding. If you promise someone something, God is holding you accountable because God sees all, God knows all. Your word must be good because God is going to hold you accountable to it. Jesus, as I said, makes the same point back in Matthew 5, verse 37. He says, let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than that comes from evil. James, the half-brother of Jesus, says the same over in James 5:12, saying, but above all, my brothers, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or by any oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation. Our word must be good. That's his point. You just need to say what you mean and mean what you say. Don't use tricky oaths. Don't swear by the altar versus the gift on the altar or the temple versus the gold in the temple. Just be straight. Just be predictable in the sense that whatever you say, you will do. Don't be tricky. Don't cross your fingers. Don't twist your... So whenever I was a kid, there's always, you'd make a promise or a commitment to a friend and, you'd have your fingers crossed behind your back and they'd say, hey, but you promised. Yeah, but I had my fingers crossed. That's what Jesus is talking about. Don't be tricky. I can think later on that, our friends would kind of pick up on this. And so they'd say, show me your hands. You're not crossing your fingers, are you? No, I'm not crossing my fingers, but I'd have my toes crossed. Couldn't see them. They were in my shoe. And then they picked up on that. Hey, your toes aren't crossed. No. And then I might be. Or twisting my tongue or whatever. The point is, don't be tricky. Your word needs to be good. Whatever you say you're going to do, you need to do it. When you and I say something, anything, we should mean it. We should not be like the Pharisees who came up with tricks and games that allowed them to be deceitful, because that's what that is. You're being deceitful. You're being dishonest. You're being intentionally deceiving. Side note, young people, really young people, kids. The difference between lying, let me back up. There are times where your parents will not do what they said. And it's not because they're lying. Lying is intentionally harmful and deceitful. Sometimes things don't pan out like the way we say. And it's just because that's how the cookie crumbles. That's how the day goes. And sometimes we can't do what we say we're going to do. It's not because we're trying to be deceitful or we're lying. That's what separates lying from everything else. Is that lying is intentionally deceitful. And lying is intentionally harmful. You're intentionally trying to trick or be tricky with other people. That's what lying is. There was a man one time that I was helping here at Franklin Heights, and I ended up not being able to hold up what I said I was going to do. And it wasn't for lack of effort. It wasn't because I was trying to be deceitful. It just didn't pan out. And he called me a liar. That's not lying. There's a difference between lying and being malicious and not being malicious and things not coming to fruition. Do you understand what I'm saying? Does that make sense? So it's an important distinction. When you and I say something, anything, we should mean it. We should not be like the Pharisees coming up with tricks and games and being deceitful. Our word should be good no matter what. End of story. We should not be the kind of people that cause others to wonder if we are going to do what we said or hold up our end of our commitment. Our word must be good. We need to be like Horton. Horton continued to sit on the egg through rain, sleet, snow, and wind. He didn't let any inconvenience or difficulty keep him from holding up his commitment. I meant what I said, and I said what I meant. An elephant is faithful 100%. We must not, here's our last note under point 2, before we get to application. We must not let any inconvenience or difficulty, that's first blank. We must not let any inconvenience or difficulty keep us from doing what we have committed to. We must not let any inconvenience or difficulty keep us from doing what we have committed to. We must not let punishment or repercussion keep us from telling the truth. Our word must be good. We must not let punishment or repercussion keep us from telling the truth. Our word must be good. Children, young people, people under the age of 18, I'm going to talk to you first. When you do something wrong, and it's a secret, and then someone finds out about it and confronts you, and says, hey, did you break the glass in the kitchen? You're suddenly faced with a dilemma. Do I tell the truth and potentially get in trouble? Or do I lie and say it wasn't me and avoid any kind of danger? The answer is always that you tell the truth and you say, I broke it, if you broke it. Don't be deceitful. Don't be tricky. Because here's the deal. If your parents find out that you lied, I promise you, you will always be in more trouble if your parents find out you lied than if you just tell the truth. Just tell the truth. Get your whippings or get your timeout, get your whatever. Maybe you don't even get that if it was an accident. Do that and be trustworthy rather than tell a lie and then later be found out and get in more trouble. Your word is more important. Your being trustworthy and honest and dependable is more important than not getting whippings. Always. It's more valuable. If people can't trust you, it is the biggest deal on the planet. If you're not dependable and reliable, it is monumental. Do not lie. Be honest with your parents. Tell the truth to your parents. Come clean. Your word must be good. Parents, do what you say. Don't tell your kids you're going to take them to the park if you're only trying to appease them and get them to shut up. That's unacceptable because you're lying. If you tell them you're going to go to the park, you'd better plan on going to the park. If you're going to play with them, you better plan on playing with them. Do what you say. On the flip side, don't make empty threats. That's also dishonesty to some extent. If you tell your child, if you do this again, I'm going to spank you, you better be prepared to whip them. If you tell them, I'm going to put you in the corner, you better be prepared to put them in the corner. Don't make empty threats. Your word must be good even when it comes to your disciplining them. Parents, I'm as guilty as any of you are. It is easy to make empty threats to try and get them to listen to you, and they call your bluff, and they're like, all right, whoop me. And it's easy to not whip them in that moment, or whatever form of discipline, sit in the chair, nose in the corner, sit on the step, time out for 5 minutes, whatever. Don't make empty threats. Be prepared to follow through. Don't tell Johnny or Susie that you're going to spank them if they don't do XYZ thing again and not mean it. If you tell them, as I said, you're going to discipline them, discipline them. Our children listen and pay attention. They learn from what you do. They will follow suit. If your word is not good, they will learn that it's okay for their word not to be good. If they learn that you don't follow through with discipline, they will keep pushing and pushing and pushing. It is so important that we be consistent with discipline. Our word must be good. Young people, this is young people 18 to, I'm going to say, 25. Do not make commitments to friends if you have no plans on upholding those commitments. Don't tell them you'll go do something if you plan to back out later. Man, that happened to me all the time when I was in high school. I'd make plans with someone, and I'd be like, yeah, I'm excited, I'm looking forward to Friday night, and then they'd say, oh, yeah, sorry, I'm going out with such and such now. Woof. That sucks. Don't be that person. If you make commitments to your friends, be prepared to keep them. Don't wait for a better option, and when the better option shows up, you go with it. You don't do that. If you already made plans and a commitment, stick to the commitment. Stick to the plans. Do what you've said. Uphold your commitments. Now, young people, this is unmarried people. Unmarried people, listen up, okay? We're going to talk about a big one here. Let's talk about marriage for a second. Eloise, you need to stop talking. Thank you. Young people who are not married, you need to think long and hard before you commit to marrying somebody. Okay? Think long and hard before you marry someone. When you get married, you're committing to be with that person until one of you dies. It's a long time. That's what you're committing to. You're committing to being with that person until one of you dies. Do not enter into marriage thinking, oh, if this doesn't work out, adios. No, we're not going to do that. That is the wrong mindset and attitude. This is a commitment. Whenever you get married, whenever you're up on stage, the preacher's there, the audience, the friends, family, loved ones, they're not there just to show up to the reception and dance. They're there to hold you accountable to a marriage, to a commitment to another person. Not only are they there and the preacher there, God is very present. And you're making a commitment to God that I'm going to ride it out through thick or thin, rich or poor, better or worse, sickness and health. I'm here. You need to think about that before you marry somebody. Okay? Think long and hard. Our word must be good. Everyone else, if you make commitments at work, keep them. This is a testimony to your faith. This is a witness to your faith. Who am I as a person? If we were to be salt and light, we need to be word-keeping kind of people. We need to be people whose word is good. That sets us apart from the world. The world is flaky and will flake and back out at the drop of a hat, at the first sign of trouble. They're not inclined to keeping their word. We are salt and light, and we set ourselves apart from the world. We are different when we keep our word, even when things get difficult and hard. Like Horton. Horton's just A-plus example. Wind, snow, rain. Horton didn't get up. If we are those kinds of people, people will tell a difference, and it will set us apart. Okay? Keep your commitments. If you make, husband and wives, if you make commitments to your spouse, I'm not talking about marriage necessarily, that commitment. I'm just talking about all others. If wife or husband says, hey, honey, will you go do this? Can you get this done for me? It is so easy to be inundated with our technology or the TV or whatever. Then we say, yeah, honey, I'll do that. Husbands, we're really guilty of this. We're busy and distracted, and it goes in one ear and out the other, and it never happens. We must not be lazy when we commit to something and do this to appease people. It's wrong. You're not keeping your word. If you're being lazy and just trying to pacify your wife, stop. If you're not going to do it, say, no, I can't do it right now. No, I can't do it then, but I can do it later maybe. We must be thoughtful. You must be intentional when you make commitments with your wife. If your wife or your husband asks you to do something, like I said, don't pacify them. Don't try to shut them up. Think about it and tell them if you can or can't do it at that moment. Our word must be good. I'm going to talk about something now I'm very guilty of. Sarcasm. Don't you laugh. I heard you, Laura. Sarcasm. Man, I'm plagued with being sarcastic. I generally try to make a point when I'm not being serious, but there are some people whom are so sarcastic you don't know whether they're coming or going, if they're telling the truth or if they're telling a lie. I mean, that is not, your word is not good if people can't trust you, even if you're being silly. You need to be straight with people, be honest with people. We should all make a commitment to being less sarcastic. There are shirts, and it's a joke, and you can get them at Walmart, but it talks about how like sarcasm is like a gift or something. Sarcasm is not necessarily a gift. I would argue with that. It's not a gift. It doesn't do anything helpful. It's usually snarky. It's usually passive-aggressive. It's just not helpful. We should commit to being less sarcastic. You're laughing at me right now, I can tell. Okay. No, yes, you are. I know you are. The problem that arises if we don't uphold our commitments, if we don't tell the truth or are sarcastic all the time, is that people won't believe or trust us. I think most of us have heard the story of the boy who cried wolf. The boy's out watching the sheep, and he goes, hee, wolf, and he yells, and all the townspeople come, and there's no wolf. Why are we here? There's no wolf. You don't need any help. He does that 3 times. 4th time, or 3rd time, or whatever, however the story goes, he cries wolf, and there is danger, and he needs help. And no one shows up because they don't trust him. If we are sarcastic all the time, if we are not reliable with our commitments, people cannot rely on us. This is not who God calls us to be. We are failing at being salt and light and set apart from the world if we are not people of our word, and our word is not good. People won't depend on us. They won't trust us. They won't believe us. Our word should be good to the point that people can depend, trust, and rely on us. One of the wonderful things, I'm getting ready to wrap up. One of the wonderful things about being people whose word is good is that we don't ever have to try and keep a fabricated story straight. I'm going to read that again. One of the wonderful things about being people whose word is always good is that we don't ever have to try and keep a fabricated story straight. Have you ever told a lie that is so big that it haunts you and you constantly have to keep it right? You cannot, there is no room for fudging the story because people will see through it and know that you're not telling the truth. You ever told a lie like that? If you haven't, thank God. But if you have, you know that it's crippling and is overwhelming. If you lie or lie compulsively, you constantly have to try and keep your story straight. There are some of you here who could be in the middle of living a big lie like this, and you constantly have to make sure you're getting it right. Here's my question. This is kind of a big one. Are you in the middle of a lie like that? Are you in the middle of deceiving all of those whom are closest to you in your life? Are you in the middle of telling the biggest, tallest tale and everyone is falling for it? Everyone believes it. Are you in the middle of that right now? Are you? Maybe that's not you. Maybe you just tell little white lies throughout your entire life all of the time. Let me tell you, those will eventually catch up to you. People will eventually start to see through stuff like that. And you will fail to be trustworthy anymore. No one will believe you. No one will ever call you for help. No one will ever ask for your help. No one will ever do anything with you because they don't know if you're dependable. If you're in the middle of a big lie right now, I want to give you some freedom. You need to come clean. But Matthew, you don't know the repercussion and the fallout. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know the cascading effect that my giant lie, if I tell the truth, you don't know what's going to happen. Here's the deal. Remember, we talked about this communion. Jesus' death is big enough for this lie too. Your lie isn't too big for Jesus to cover. You can be forgiven of it. You can be relieved of the crushing weight that this lie is causing on your life. Same for the white lies. You can be freed from these. You know what the answer is? Just tell the truth. Always just tell the truth. Always just be honest. Always just do what you've committed to. It's that easy. It's not complicated. It's not complex. It's not tricky. Just be honest, always. Brothers and sisters, we need to be like Horton. This is your last note in your notes. Let our mantra be, I meant what I said and I said what I meant. A Christian is faithful 100%. Let our mantra be, I meant what I said and I said what I meant. A Christian is faithful 100%. Maybe you're in the middle of a big lie and you don't know what to do. I'm going to be standing over here in just a second. If you don't know what to do, come talk. Let's talk. Let's hash it out. I'd love to have a conversation with you. I'd love to encourage you. I'd love to walk through that with you. Let's stand and sing. Brothers and sisters, let's be people of our word. Let's be people who mean what they say and say what they mean. Let's be people who are not tricky or deceitful, but let our word be good. Okay? Let's pray. God, I pray that you would instill in us with great conviction that we must be people who tell the truth. We must be people whose word is good, who are dependable and hold up their commitments. God, if we're living a big lie, if we're covering up a big lie, if we are maintaining a giant facade and everyone is ignorant to it, God, let us come clean. Let us be honest. Let us reveal the truth. Father God, we love you. It's in Jesus' name we pray, amen. Let's sing.